Welcome back to part 2 of the Large Scale Henrietta project. This time I'll finish adding details to the chassis, apply paint, and finish with reassembly of the chassis. When looking at Henrietta's CGI model, I noticed that she has these vertical plates on the bottom of her chassis. Now I'm not sure what these are exactly, but the LGB coach I got for this project has air tanks in this area. I'll take these off and set them aside, and then look into making the new parts which will go in their place. To make these, I'll be using 1mm styrene, which is measured and then cut to size. After sanding, the new pieces are test fitted on the chassis, but I found them to be too tall and had to shorten them. Once cut to the correct size, I rough up the inside of the chassis where the pieces mount, and then super glue them in place, making sure they are positioned correctly. These pieces are also meant to have some diagonal bars on them, so I cut out more of the 1mm styrene to size and then glue them in place, leaving a little extra on the bottom which I can sand down later. Once in place, the extra material is removed and the diagonals are made flush with the bottom of the pieces that I installed earlier. Finishing off the buffer beams comes next. There's holes where original details mounted that I want to fill in, and I'll be using some JB Quick Weld to do this. I'll also go back over these areas with some putty afterwards to fill in any remaining issues. I mix equal parts of the steel and hardener together and then apply it with a toothpick over the areas I want to fill in. I'm using masking tape to ensure that JB Quick stays where I apply it, and also to save on cleanup later on. While the JB Quick is setting, I want to add the notches in the corners of the buffer beams like Henrietta has. I do all this with a file and then finish off the edges with sandpaper. By this point the JB Quick is set, so I can sand that down as well. Once sanded, I go back over the buffer beams with spot putty. After another sanding, I apply a coat of primer which will show any areas that still need attention. When looking at both buffer beams, I notice quite a few imperfections. More putty is applied and another sanding is required, but after a second coat of primer, it looks like the chassis is ready for paint. I want to paint the buffer beams first, so I'll mask off the rest of the chassis and apply 2 coats of gloss red paint. After drying for a couple hours, I'll mask off the buffer beams to paint the rest of the chassis black. Before I do this, I apply a clear coat over the buffer beams to seal the edges of the masking tape. I do this to prevent the black paint from bleeding onto the red in case the masking tape doesn't do its job. I give the chassis 2 coats of satin black and then set it aside to dry. I also paint the new coupler mounts I made as well. After 24 hours, the paint is cured and I can begin reassembly. I'll start by putting the wheels and axles back in place, and then install the screws into the mounting brackets. Unfortunately, someone ran off with my set of screwdrivers, so I've had to resort to using an older set, which doesn't really work as well. Next, I glue in the buffers and hooks, making sure that the flat part of the pin is facing upwards. This indicates the correct orientation of the buffers. When test fitting the hooks, I notice they interfere with the lowering blocks for the couplers. To fix this, I'll file down the pin to where it just fits through the hole. With that modification, the hooks can be installed. Putting the couplers back on is exactly the same as I did it in part 1. Installed the mounting plate with the 2 screws, install the lowering block with its screw, and then slide the coupler in place on the lowering block and install the screw for that. With everything back together, the chassis is finished and doesn't require any more work at this time. Overall, Henrietta is starting to come together and I can move on to the upper portion of the coach now. See you all in part 3.